On March 15th, 1979, at approximately 3:20 in the afternoon, Major Viktor Alexeyevich Sokolov walked into an office on the third floor of Lubyanka that would redefine the boundaries of his loyalty. He was 38 years old. The summons had arrived that morning, a telephone call to his desk at the Second Chief Directorate, a voice he didn't recognize instructing him to report to room 347 at precisely 3:20 p.m. No explanation, no context. In the architecture of Soviet intelligence, such ambiguity was its own form of communication. The office was smaller than Viktor expected, barely large enough for the metal desk and two chairs that occupied it. A single window overlooked Jashinsky Square, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the bare walls. The man behind the desk was perhaps 50, with the colorless appearance of someone who had spent decades in windowless rooms. Viktor had never seen him before. "Sit down, Major." No introduction, no pleasantries. The superior, Viktor would never learn his name, opened a manila folder and slid it across the desk with the casual gesture of someone passing a lunch menu. Inside were photographs, 6 of them. All taken with a telephoto lens, all dated within the past 2 weeks. His wife, Irina, walking along Kropotkinskaya Street. Irina entering the Institute of Oriental Studies. Irina sitting at a cafe table across from a man Viktor recognized immediately, Dr. Leonid Berger, a scholar of Persian literature, a colleague from her department. "Your wife has been meeting regularly with this individual." The superior's finger tapped one of the photographs. "Dr. Berger applied for an exit visa last year. It was denied. He maintains contact with known refusnik elements. We have reason to believe he's organizing anti-Soviet activities within academic circles." Viktor felt something tighten in his chest. He kept his face neutral, a skill perfected over 16 years of service. "I know Dr. Berger," Viktor said carefully. "He and his wife are friends of our family. He's an academic, We're not interested in your personal assessment." The interruption was delivered without hostility, which somehow made it worse. "We're interested in your wife's level of involvement with his activities." The superior produced another document from the folder, a typed directive, 2 paragraphs, marked with classification stamps Viktor knew well. The language was bureaucratic, precise. Subject: Irina Mikhailovna Sokolova. Objective: surveillance and documentation of contacts, conversations and ideological indicators. Duration: indefinite. Reporting officer: Major V.A. Sokolov. You'll monitor her activities, daily logs, weekly reports filed directly to this office. Standard surveillance protocols apply. We'll provide the necessary equipment. The man paused, studying Viktor's face for reaction. "You are not to inform anyone of this assignment. That includes your wife, especially your wife." The room felt smaller, suddenly, the walls pressing inward. Viktor had conducted surveillance operations in Afghanistan, had run informants in circles that included diplomats and military officers, had written reports that led to arrests and interrogations. But those subjects had been strangers, enemies of the state, abstract threats to Soviet security. "Is there a problem, Major?" Viktor realized he'd been silent too long. "No, no problem." "Good." The superior closed the folder. "You understand the sensitivity here. Your wife works with restricted materials. Foreign language texts, communications with international academic institutions. Dr. Berger's influence on her thinking is a legitimate security concern. We need to establish whether she's simply naive or actively sympathetic to his views." Viktor understood what wasn't being said, that his own loyalty was now under scrutiny as well, that this assignment was a test as much as an investigation. He was born in 1941 in Kaluga, had joined the Komsomol at 14 and the party at 22. His service record documented commendations from operations in Kabul, 2 medals for actions he was forbidden to discuss even with his wife. Married to Irina for 14 years. 2 children, Natasha, 12, and Alexei, 8. The life he'd built existed within the structures of Soviet power, depended on his continued usefulness to those structures. "You'll start immediately," the superior continued. "There's a specialist waiting in room 351 who will brief you on the technical requirements." The meeting lasted 11 minutes total. Victor left with the folder and walked 2 doors down to collect his equipment. Room 351 contained a technician who spoke in the flat tones of someone who'd conducted this briefing many times before. A metal case, approximately 8 inches by 6 inches, contained a recording device model RTU-47, standard KGB issue for domestic surveillance. Instructions for installation in a residential telephone. A notebook for daily observations, roughly 3 by 5 inches, with numbered pages. Contact procedures for dead drops at 3 locations in Gorky Park. A code system for marking levels of concern in his reports. The technician demonstrated the equipment's operation, never once asking about the surveillance target. To him, Victor was simply another officer receiving another assignment. The machinery of state security operated on such compartmentalization, each person knowing only their small piece of a larger operation that stretched across every corner of Soviet life. By the time Victor left Lubyanka, the sun had dropped below Moscow's roofline. He carried the metal case in his left hand, the weight of it somehow greater than its actual mass. The streets were crowded with people leaving work, filing into metro stations, heading home to families and dinners and the ordinary rhythms of evening. He walked without destination at first, following Sretenka Street north, then turning west toward the neighborhood where he'd lived for 7 years. The second chief directorate's obsession with ideological purity had intensified during this period. Historians would later call the era of stagnation, the final years of Brezhnev's rule, when the Soviet Union's certainties were beginning to calcify into paranoia. Victor had seen the directives, the statistical targets for identifying potential dissidents, the pressure on officers to demonstrate vigilance. He reached his building on Ulitsa Gorkogo as dusk settled into darkness. 9 stories of standard Soviet construction, concrete and functional, housing 48 families. Apartment 7B. Home. Victor stood on the sidewalk across the street, looking up at the windows where lights were beginning to appear. The 6th floor windows on the left would be his own apartment. Irina would be preparing dinner. The children would be finishing homework at the small table in the kitchen. A Thursday evening in March, unremarkable routine. He looked down at the metal case in his hand. He could not go inside. Not yet, not carrying this. Victor stood there as the temperature dropped and pedestrians passed without noticing him, a man frozen on a Moscow street, unable to cross the distance between the world he'd served and the world he'd built within it. They met in the autumn of 1963 in the reading room of Moscow State University's Lenin Library. Victor was 22, studying history with a focus on international relations, though his real education was happening in smaller rooms with instructors who never appeared on any official faculty roster. Irina Mikhailovna Petrova was 20, a languages student whose facility with Persian and Arabic had already attracted attention from her professors. She was translating a medieval text when Victor sat down across from her, ostensibly to study, but primarily to find an excuse to speak with the dark-haired woman he'd noticed for 3 consecutive Thursdays. Their courtship followed the patterns available to Soviet students in that era. Long walks along the Moscow River. Attendance at approved cultural events, ballet at the Bolshoi when they could afford tickets, poetry readings at the university. Irina introduced him to Akhmatova's work, reading verses aloud in the kitchen of her dormitory while other students prepared tea on a communal hot plate. Viktor told her about his childhood in Kaluga, about his father's work in a munitions factory, about joining the Komsomol at 14 with genuine belief in building a better world. He did not tell her in those early months about the recruitment. It happened in the spring of 1964. Two men in civilian clothes invited him to a cafe near Lubyanka Square. The conversation was cordial, almost casual. They knew about his academic performance, his party membership, his language skills. He'd studied English and German to near fluency. They mentioned opportunities for service, for meaningful work that would use his talents in defense of Soviet interests. Viktor understood what was being offered. Within a month, he'd accepted. By the time he married Irina in June 1965, he was already attending training sessions that would never appear in any official record. The wedding took place in a workers' palace on the outskirts of Moscow. 43 guests. Irina wore a white dress borrowed from her cousin. Viktor's parents traveled from Kaluga, his mother carrying a loaf of bread and salt in accordance with tradition. The ceremony lasted 20 minutes. There was no priest, no religious element. Such things were possible in 1965 only in whispers and hidden rooms. Instead, a party official read pronouncements about socialist marriage and the duties of Soviet citizens to family and state. They moved into a single room in a communal apartment on Arbat Street. 3 other families shared the kitchen and bathroom. Privacy existed only in the space between their bed and the wall. When Natasha was born in March 1967, Irina's mother came from Voronezh to help, sleeping on a folding cot near the infant's cradle. Viktor was away for the birth, a training exercise in the Caucasus that lasted 6 weeks. The apartment on Ulitsa Gorkogo came in 1969, a reward for Viktor's growing value to the Second Chief Directorate. 2 rooms, their own bathroom, a kitchen with a window overlooking the courtyard. By Soviet standards, they had achieved comfort. Irina established her workspace in the corner of the main room, her Persian dictionaries and Arabic grammars arranged on shelves Viktor built from scavenged lumber. She'd found work at the Institute of Oriental Studies translating historical documents and occasional diplomatic correspondence that required her to sign security agreements. She showed Viktor with mild amusement. "They act as though medieval poetry poses a threat to the revolution," she said. Viktor, who knew exactly how surveillance of foreign language specialists worked, said nothing. Their son Alexei arrived in February 1971. 4 years between the children, 2 rooms for a family of 4. Weekend routines developed, visits to Viktor's parents' dacha outside Moscow, where his father maintained a vegetable garden and his mother preserved fruit in jars that lined the cellar walls. New Year's celebrations with Irina's colleagues from the Institute, gatherings where conversation ranged across literature and politics with a freedom that made Viktor quietly nervous. His career progressed along tracks invisible to his wife. Commendations for work he couldn't describe. A posting to Afghanistan in 1975, officially listed as a military liaison but actually involving intelligence gathering among tribal contacts near Herat. He returned after 8 months with a medal he was permitted to display but not explain. The party advanced him to positions of greater responsibility. Irina observed his rising status through its manifestations: better access to consumer goods, the ability to obtain books not generally available, invitations to events reserved for those with proper clearance levels. She never asked directly about his work. Perhaps she understood that such questions had no safe answers. Her own world expanded throughout the 1970s. The Institute of Oriental Studies housed some of Moscow's most intellectually adventurous academics, people who pushed against ideological constraints while maintaining the appearance of loyalty. Irina's circle included linguists, historians, philosophers, many of them Jewish, many with family members who'd emigrated or tried to. She translated texts that exposed her to ideas from beyond Soviet borders, to ways of thinking that existed outside Marxist-Leninist frameworks. Declassified files from the KGB's 7th Department reveal that Irina Mikhailovna Sokolova first appeared in surveillance logs in October 1976. The notation was brief. Subject maintains social contact with persons of operational interest. No action was recommended. The observation was routine, part of the Second Chief Directorate's comprehensive monitoring of academic institutions where foreign connections made everyone potentially suspect. A second notation appeared in March 1977. Subject attended unsanctioned poetry reading featuring work of prescribed authors. The event had taken place in a private apartment. 23 people were present. All were documented. Again, no action recommended, but the file remained open. Victor knew nothing of these reports. The machinery of surveillance operated in compartments, sharing information only when operational necessity required it. While he filed his own reports on Afghan tribal leaders and potential security risks among military personnel, his wife's name was accumulating entries in a different filing system entirely. The year 1978 brought changes in Irina's demeanor that Victor noticed but couldn't interpret. She became more outspoken at gatherings, less cautious in expressing opinions about Soviet cultural policy. When the government expelled dissidents or denied exit visas to refuseniks, she spoke with barely concealed anger. Victor attributed this to her friend Dr. Berger, whose application for emigration had been denied in May of that year. The dinner party happened on February 9, 1979, barely a month before Victor would receive his assignment. They were hosting 6 colleagues from the Institute, a Friday evening gathering in their apartment. Irina had prepared borscht and black bread. Someone brought Georgian wine. The conversation began with academic matters, translation difficulties, funding cuts, bureaucratic frustrations, then drifted toward more dangerous territory. One of the guests mentioned that a junior researcher had been dismissed for maintaining correspondence with Israeli academics. The official reason was ideological unreliability. Everyone at the table knew what this meant. Irina set down her wine glass with enough force that the stem nearly cracked. Mikhail Rosenberg, she said, is one of the finest scholars in the department. His crime is having family in Tel Aviv. His grandfather escaped the pogroms. Now we punish him for this? The room went quiet. Victor felt his chest constrict. The policy is clear, one of the older guests said carefully. Contact with foreign nationals requires approval. The policy is absurd. Irina's voice carried an edge Victor rarely heard. We claim to be an internationalist society, but we treat our own citizens like prisoners. Berger can't leave. Rosenberg can't write to his cousins. We're scholars, not criminals. Victor watched the faces around the table, some nodding, others looking away. He should have said something, deflected the conversation, protected his wife from her own passion. Instead, he remained silent, calculating which of these guests might file reports of their own. The evening ended earlier than planned. After the guests departed, Irina was still agitated. "Did I embarrass you?" she asked. "No," Victor lied. "You spoke honestly." Standing outside his apartment building 4 weeks later, holding a metal case containing surveillance equipment meant for his own telephone, Victor replayed that conversation with new understanding. The guests' names, Irina's words, the dangerous clarity of her conviction, all of it would soon appear in his reports, documented in his own handwriting. The life they'd built across 14 years, ordinary and precious and Soviet, had already begun its dismantling. He simply hadn't known it yet. Victor installed the recording device on March 17, 1979, a Saturday morning, while Irina took the children to the market. The RTU-47 fit inside the telephone housing with the precision of equipment designed for exactly this purpose. He worked quickly, his hands steady, despite the nausea rising in his throat. The device would activate automatically when the receiver was lifted, capturing both sides of any conversation on a miniature tape that required changing every 72 hours. Standard KGB equipment. He'd installed identical units in a dozen apartments during his career, always belonging to strangers. The telephone sat on a small table in the hallway, between the children's bedroom and the main room. Irina used it most frequently, calling colleagues at the institute, arranging meetings, talking with her mother in Voronezh. Ordinary conversations that would now be recorded, transcribed, analyzed for ideological deviation. He tested the mechanism twice. Both times, the tape spooled correctly. He replaced the housing and stepped back. The telephone looked exactly as it had before. When Irina returned with Natasha and Alexei, arms full of vegetables and bread, Victor was reading Pravda at the kitchen table as though nothing had changed. The first written report was due Thursday, March 22nd. Victor had spent the week documenting Irina's movements in the small numbered notebook provided by the technician. Each entry followed the format drilled into him during training: date, time, location, activity, persons present, duration. March 17th. Subject: departed apartment at 9:15 a.m. with children, returned 11:40 a.m. No unusual contacts observed. March 18th. Subject: traveled to Institute of Oriental Studies, arrived 8:50 a.m. Remained until 6:30 p.m. Evening at home. No visitors. March 19th. Subject attended lecture at Moscow State University, Department of History. Topic: medieval trade routes in Central Asia, accompanied by colleague Dr. L. Berger and 3 other institute staff. Returned home 10:20 p.m. The prose was clinical, empty of emotion. Victor had written hundreds of such reports. The difference was that these observations were made from inside his own apartment, watching his wife grade student translations at the kitchen table, listening to her read bedtime stories to Alexei in a voice gentle with affection. The dead drop system operated on a fixed schedule. Every Thursday at 6:00 a.m., Victor would leave his written report inside a weathered newspaper box in Gorky Park, near the pond where children sailed toy boats in summer. A chalk mark on a specific bench signaled that material had been deposited. By noon, the report would be collected, analyzed, filed. Victor would receive acknowledgement through a return mark, a small X on a lamppost near the park's western entrance. His first report covered the week of March 17 to 23. 3 handwritten pages, Irina's schedule, her contacts, fragments of overheard conversations. The material was thoroughly mundane: discussions about translation methodology, complaints about administrative bureaucracy at the institute, a telephone call with her mother discussing Natasha's progress in school. Nothing incriminating. Nothing that suggested anti-Soviet activity or ideological unreliability. Victor filed the report on Thursday morning, walking through Gorky Park as dawn broke over Moscow. The city was quiet at that hour, just street cleaners and early shift workers heading to factories. He made the drop, marked the bench, walked home. By afternoon, the confirmation mark appeared on the lamppost. The telephone recordings produced even less useful material. Irina's conversations were brief, practical. She arranged a meeting with a colleague to discuss a translation of a 10th century Persian text. She spoke with the building superintendent about a leaking pipe. She called her mother, and talked about whether Alexei needed glasses. He'd been squinting at his schoolwork. Victor changed the tape every 3 days, transcribing the conversations in a separate section of his report. The process required him to sit alone in the apartment when his family was out, listening to his wife's voice through headphones, documenting words spoken in the belief that she was talking privately. The second report, filed March 29th, was similarly empty of concerning content. So was the third, filed April 5th. On April 12th, Victor was summoned back to room 347. The same superior sat behind the same desk. He'd been reading Victor's reports, now gathered in a thin file folder marked with Irina's name and a case number, 4788K. Major Sokolov, no greeting. Your reports indicate your wife maintains regular contact with Dr. Berger and associates from his circle. Yet, you've documented no substantive conversations about his political activities or his exit visa application. The conversations I've observed have been academic in nature, Victor said carefully. Translation work, research topics. Then you're not listening closely enough. The superior opened the file, scanned a page. Dr. Berger is organizing a petition protesting the dismissal of Jewish scholars from research positions. We know this. Your wife works closely with him. She must be aware of his activities. Victor kept his expression neutral. If she is, she hasn't discussed it at home or on the telephone. Perhaps she's cautious. The superior studied Victor's face. Or perhaps you're being selective in what you report. The implication hung in the air between them. Victor understood the mathematics of the situation. An officer whose wife was under investigation could not produce exonerating reports without raising questions about his own reliability. The system demanded results. If he found nothing suspicious, the assumption would be that he was protecting her rather than that she was innocent. I'm reporting everything I observe, Victor said. Then observe more carefully. The superior closed the file. We need conversations with associates. We need ideological indicators. We need evidence of her level of involvement with Berger's activities. Your next report should reflect more thorough surveillance. Victor left the meeting understanding that his orders had changed, finding nothing was no longer acceptable. He needed to find something, document something, prove that his loyalty to the state superseded his loyalty to his wife. That evening, he sat at the kitchen table while Irina helped Natasha with mathematics homework at the other end. Fractions. Natasha was struggling with the concept. Growing frustrated, Irina was patient, breaking down each problem into smaller steps, encouraging her daughter with gentle praise when she arrived at the correct answer. Victor watched them and saw what he would write in his report. Subject spent evening at home, no unusual activity observed. He saw what he would not write, the way Irina tucked a strand of hair behind Natasha's ear, the pride in her smile when their daughter solved a difficult problem, the ordinary love that filled their cramped apartment like warmth from the radiator. The psychological split had begun. Victor, the husband, sat at the kitchen table, grateful for this family he'd built across 14 years. Victor, the officer, sat in the same chair, calculating how to satisfy his superiors while protecting the woman he'd promised to cherish. KGB archives from this period contain numerous cases of family members informing on each other. A father who reported his son's involvement with samizdat publishers, a wife who documented her husband's listening to Voice of America broadcasts, a sister who testified against her brother in a trial for anti-Soviet agitation. The files describe these informants with bureaucratic neutrality, as though betrayal of one's family was simply another administrative function in service to the state. What the files rarely document is the cost of such service, the corrosion of trust, the weight of secrets, the slow destruction of the self required to maintain two incompatible identities. On April 26th, Victor filed his fourth report. He included more detail about Irina's conversations with Berger, more names of colleagues she met for lunch, more quotations from telephone calls. None of it was fabricated. He simply selected material that implied concern without actually demonstrating wrongdoing, a careful balance between satisfying his superiors and protecting his wife. The confirmation mark appeared on the lamppost that afternoon. Victor walked home through streets crowded with people living ordinary lives, unaware that some among them were writing reports about family members, neighbors, colleagues. The machinery of surveillance operated invisibly, sustained by thousands of small betrayals, each one justified as necessary for collective security. He arrived at his building as Irina was preparing dinner. Cabbage soup. The smell filled their apartment, familiar and comforting. She smiled when he entered, asked about his day. Victor told her it had been routine, nothing worth mentioning. She believed him because they were married, because trust was the foundation of what they'd built together. Victor hung his coat and washed his hands and sat down to eat with his family, carrying the weight of what she didn't know. Leonid Davidovich Berger was born in Moscow in 1927, 3 months before his father was arrested during Stalin's first wave of purges. The KGB file on Berger, declassified in 1997 and archived under reference number K284778, begins with his father's case. David Berger, a chemist at a state research facility, was accused of participation in a Trotskyist conspiracy that existed only in the imagination of NKVD interrogators. He signed a confession after 6 weeks in Lubyanka's basement. The sentence was 15 years in a labor camp near Magadan. He survived 8. Leonid's mother, Raisa, raised him and his younger brother Mikhail in a single room on the outskirts of Moscow, sustaining the family through work in a textile factory. The boys were educated in Soviet schools where their father's status as an enemy of the people went unmentioned, a shadow everyone could see, but no one acknowledged. Leonid learned early to navigate the space between what was true and what could be safely spoken. His academic gifts became apparent in gymnasium. Languages came to him with an ease his teachers found remarkable: Russian, Hebrew, Persian, Arabic, French. By 18, he'd gained admission to Moscow State University despite his father's record, a testament to either his brilliance or the university's need for linguists during the war's aftermath. He specialized in medieval Persian poetry, drawn to the mathematical precision of classical forms, the way meaning could be encoded in rhyme and meter. Documents from the Institute of Oriental Studies show that Berger joined the faculty in 1951 at age 24. His doctoral dissertation on the ghazals of Hafez was considered groundbreaking. Over the next 2 decades, he published 17 papers in Soviet academic journals and 4 books that established him as one of the world's leading authorities on Persian literary tradition. He married Vera Yakovlevna in 1953. They had no children. Vera's medical history, documented in a separate KGB file, indicates 2 miscarriages and a stillbirth that left her unable to conceive. Neighbors interviewed in 1979 described the Bergers as devoted to each other, quiet, cultured people who hosted occasional gatherings where conversation ranged across literature and music. The first notation of political concern appeared in Berger's file in 1967, when he requested permission to attend an international conference on Persian studies in Tehran. The request was denied. A second request in 1969 for a conference in Paris was also denied. The pattern repeated throughout the 1970s, Berger applying for travel authorization, the applications rejected with increasing brevity. His brother Mikhail emigrated to Israel in 1973, part of the limited Jewish exodus permitted during that period. The departure was documented in both brothers' KGB files. Leonid and Vera accompanied Mikhail to Sheremetyevo Airport. A surveillance photograph from that day shows Leonid embracing his brother on the curb, both men's faces marked by an emotion the caption describes as inappropriate attachment to foreign destination. After Mikhail's departure, Berger's file was upgraded to Category 2 surveillance. Monthly reports from informants at the Institute, periodic monitoring of his correspondence, documentation of his social contacts. He was transferred from advanced research to teaching undergraduate courses, his access to restricted library materials curtailed. The official reason given was reorganization of departmental priorities. Irina Sokolova first appears in Berger's file in 1974, identified as a junior colleague with expertise in Arabic translation. The notation describes their professional relationship as mentor and protégé. Berger had recognized Irina's linguistic talents and taken particular interest in developing her skills. They collaborated on a translation of a 13th-century Persian astronomical text published in 1975 with both their names on the cover. The friendship between the two families deepened over the years that followed. The Bergers became regular guests at the Sokolov apartment, attending New Year's celebrations and birthday gatherings. Childless themselves, Leonid and Vera treated Natasha and Alexei with the affection of honorary aunt and uncle. Leonid taught Natasha to play chess. Vera knitted sweaters for both children, complex patterns that took months to complete. Witnesses interviewed after Berger's arrest recalled him as gentle, scholarly, someone who could discuss medieval poetry with the same passion most men reserved for football. He collected books. His apartment contained perhaps 3,000 volumes, many acquired through networks of underground exchange since they weren't available through official channels. In May 1978, Berger submitted an application for an exit visa to Israel. The decision followed months of deliberation with Vera, who supported the move despite her own fears about leaving Moscow. They were aging. Leonid was 51, Vera 49. Mikhail had been urging them to join him in Haifa, where he'd established himself as a professor of linguistics at the university. The application was denied within 2 weeks. No explanation was provided, though the reason was obvious to anyone familiar with Soviet policy. Berger's work with restricted materials and his knowledge of institute operations made him a security risk. His expertise couldn't be allowed to benefit a foreign state, even one with which the USSR maintained limited diplomatic relations. 3 days after the denial, Berger was summoned to the Institute Director's office and informed of his dismissal. The official cause was cited as reduction in staff due to budgetary constraints. He was offered alternative employment, a teaching position at a technical college in a Moscow suburb, instructing engineering students in basic English. The salary was 60% of what he'd earned at the institute. Berger accepted because there was no alternative. A Soviet citizen without employment was a parasite, subject to arrest and compulsory labor assignment. He began teaching in September 1978, traveling 90 minutes each way on crowded metro trains to deliver lessons to students who resented the language requirement and showed no interest in learning. Irina's response to Berger's dismissal appears in multiple KGB surveillance reports from this period. She argued with the institute director, threatened to resign in protest, circulated an unofficial petition among colleagues calling for Berger's reinstatement. The director warned her that such activities could jeopardize her own position. Several colleagues advised her to distance herself from Berger for the sake of her career. She refused. Throughout the autumn of 1978, Irina maintained regular contact with Leonid and Vera, meeting for tea, attending lectures together, continuing their collaborative work on translations during evenings at the Bergers' apartment. Victor noted this loyalty with mixed feelings, pride in his wife's integrity and growing concern about where that integrity might lead. His instructions, beginning in March 1979, were explicit. Document every interaction between Irina and the Burgers, every telephone call, every visit, every conversation. The assumption underlying these orders was that Berger represented a threat to state security, and anyone maintaining close association with him was potentially compromised. What Victor's instructions didn't reveal, what he wouldn't learn until much later, was the extent of Berger's actual activities. Starting in late 1978, Berger had begun working with an underground network that produced and distributed samizdat literature. The operation was organized by a group of refuseniks and dissidents operating across Moscow, people whose requests to emigrate had been denied and who'd consequently lost official employment. They typed copies of banned texts, Solzhenitsyn's novels, Mandelstam's poetry, essays by Sakharov, on carbon paper, creating chains of distribution that moved through trusted contacts. Berger's role was editorial and curatorial. His apartment became a library of prohibited materials. He authenticated texts, verified translations, helped select works for reproduction. The operation was careful, compartmentalized. Most participants knew only their immediate contacts, a structure designed to limit damage if the network was penetrated. Irina knew nothing of this. Berger had deliberately kept her ignorant, understanding that her association with him already placed her at risk. When she visited the Bergers' apartment, the banned books were hidden, the typing equipment stored in a locked cabinet. Their conversations remained focused on legitimate academic work, translations of medieval texts that posed no ideological threat. But the KGB surveillance network that monitored Berger had identified the samizdat operation by early 1979. They hadn't yet moved to make arrests, preferring to document the full scope of the network before dismantling it. Every person who visited Berger's apartment was photographed. Every name in his address book was cross-referenced against existing files. Irina's name appeared frequently, too frequently. Victor's weekly reports throughout May documented Irina and the Bergers' continued friendship. Dinner on May 4th at the Sokolovs' apartment, cabbage rolls and black bread, conversation about Persian poets and the difficulty of translating metaphors across centuries. A visit on May 18th to the Bergers' apartment, where Irina brought Natasha and Alexei, and the children played chess while the adults discussed a particularly complex Arabic manuscript Irina was working on. Nothing in these interactions suggested political conspiracy, but in the logic of Soviet security apparatus, association itself was evidence. The machinery didn't require proof of wrongdoing, only proximity to those already suspected. By June 1979, Berger's file had grown to 187 pages. Irina's file, cross-referenced with his, contained 42 pages. Victor's reports accounted for 23 of them, observations written in his careful handwriting, documentation of a friendship between two families that appeared entirely ordinary to everyone except the men reading the files in offices where suspicion was a professional obligation. What none of them knew yet was that the observation phase was ending. Somewhere in those offices a decision had been made. On the evening of August 12, 1979, the Sokolov family arrived at the Bergers' apartment on Tverskaya Street, carrying a bottle of Georgian wine and a birthday cake Irina had baked that afternoon. Leonid Berger was turning 52. The celebration was modest by design. 8 guests gathered in the Bergers' main room, which was lined floor to ceiling with books in 6 languages. Vera had prepared herring under a fur coat and Olivier salad, dishes that required ingredients she'd spent days acquiring through a network of favors and queue standing that characterized Soviet domestic life. A record player in the corner played Shostakovich's string quartets at low volume. Victor recognized most of the guests. Dr. Mikhail Granovsky, a historian specializing in medieval Russia, whom Victor had met at previous gatherings. Anna Leibovitz, a translator like Irina, recently dismissed from her position at a publishing house for reasons that remained officially unexplained. A married couple named Sorokin, he taught philosophy, she worked as a librarian at a technical institute. Two younger academics Viktor hadn't met before, introduced as colleagues of Granovsky's from Moscow State University. Viktor positioned himself near the window, accepting a glass of wine he barely touched, observing the room with the attention his training had made reflexive. He noted who arrived when, who spoke with whom, the topics that emerged and receded as conversation flowed around the cramped space. The evening began safely enough. Discussions about academic matters, upcoming conferences, problems with journal publications, complaints about administrative incompetence that everyone could agree on without risk. Leonid opened his gifts, a volume of Rumi's poetry from Irina, a set of fountain pens from the Sorokins, a recording of Glenn Gould playing Bach from Granovsky. Viktor watched Irina move through the gathering with ease, refilling glasses, laughing at Leonid's dry observations about the absurdities of teaching English to engineering students who would never leave the Soviet Union. She looked happy in a way she hadn't recently at home. The realization produced a sensation Viktor couldn't quite name, something between guilt and resentment. The turn came around 9 o'clock, after the cake had been served and the wine had loosened inhibitions. Granovsky mentioned an article he'd read in Samizdat, a physician's account of conditions in psychiatric hospitals where political dissidents were held. The piece described forced medication, diagnostic categories invented to pathologize dissent, indefinite detention without trial. Granovsky spoke carefully, his words chosen to describe rather than condemn, but the very act of mentioning Samizdat shifted the room's atmosphere. Anna Leibovitz said she'd heard that 3 more refuseniks had been arrested the previous week. Charges of parasitism, they'd lost their jobs after applying for exit visas, then been prosecuted for unemployment. The system criminalizes its own victims, one of the younger academics said. First it denies them the right to leave, then it denies them the right to work, then it arrests them for not working. Several people nodded. Viktor remained motionless by the window, the wine glass cold in his hand. The conversation accelerated, ideas building on each other with the momentum of people who'd been holding words back for too long. Someone brought up Andrei Sakharov, the physicist whose advocacy for human rights had led to his internal exile in Gorky earlier that year. Sakharov had been forbidden from contact with foreigners, his telephone line disconnected, his movements restricted to a city closed to outside visitors. A Nobel laureate, Granovsky said, treated like a common criminal for the crime of speaking truth about thermonuclear weapons and human rights. Vera Berger glanced nervously at her husband. Leonid's expression was difficult to read, pride mixed with caution, the look of someone who'd learned to navigate dangerous conversations without quite avoiding them. Irina spoke then. Her voice was calm, measured, but carried conviction that made Viktor's chest tighten. Soviet scientists should be free to communicate with international colleagues, Bigdal, she said. Scientific progress doesn't recognize borders. When we isolate our researchers, when we punish them for international cooperation, we damage our own advancement. Sakharov's crime isn't espionage or treason. His crime is believing that knowledge should serve humanity rather than state power. The room went quiet. Not the silence of disagreement, but the silence of people hearing their own thoughts spoken aloud in words they'd been too careful to voice. Viktor's mind was already cataloguing Irina's statement, the context, the witnesses present. Each element was evidence, material for the report he would file within 18 hours. He said nothing, offered no agreement, no counter-argument, no deflection. His silence felt like cowardice and calculation in equal measure. The conversation moved on, grew lighter, drifted back towards safer territory. But the moment had been recorded, not just in Victor's memory, but in the attention of everyone present, each person now carrying knowledge of what had been said and who had said it. They left the Berger's apartment around 11. The metro ride home was quiet. Natasha had fallen asleep against Irina's shoulder. Alexei talked about the chess game Leonid had taught him, a variation he wanted to practice. Irina smiled and stroked his hair and looked out the window at the tunnel walls rushing past. In their bedroom that night, after the children were asleep, Irina sat on the edge of their bed and asked the question Victor had been anticipating. "You were very quiet tonight. Is something wrong?" "I was tired," Victor said. "Long week at work." She studied his face with the attention of someone who'd shared a bed with him for 14 years. "You've been different lately. Distant. Is there something you're not telling me?" The irony was so sharp it felt physical. Victor met her eyes and constructed his lie from pieces of truth. "Work has been demanding. New responsibilities. I'm sorry if I've seemed distracted." Irina reached out and touched his hand. "You know you can talk to me, whatever it is." "I know," Victor said. She kissed him good night and turned off the lamp and settled into sleep with the trust of someone who believed the man beside her was still the person she'd married. Victor lay awake in the darkness, listening to her breathing, composing the report in his mind. The next morning, Thursday, he left for Gorky Park before dawn. The report he deposited in the dead drop was the most detailed he'd written. 4 pages documenting the previous evening with precision that would satisfy his superiors and damn nearly everyone present. He included Irina's statement about Sakharov and scientific freedom, word for word as he'd committed it to memory. He listed all 8 guests by name, noted their professions, described the overall tone of the gathering as ideologically questionable. He mentioned the samizdat reference, the discussion of Refusenik arrests, the general atmosphere of criticism directed at state policy. He did not mention that most of what was said was objectively true. Truth was not a defense in the machinery he served. The confirmation mark appeared on the lamppost by afternoon. Within 3 days, 2 of the younger academics were summoned for questioning by the KGB. Granovsky was called to the director's office at Moscow State University and warned that his association with unreliable elements put his position at risk. Anna Leibovitz, already dismissed from her previous job, found herself unable to obtain new employment anywhere in Moscow's publishing sector. The interrogations were standard procedure, documented in later files as prophylactic conversations designed to intimidate without formally charging. Both academics were asked about their attendance at the birthday party, about conversations they'd overheard, about their relationship with Leonid Berger. Neither mentioned Irina's statement about Sakharov. Perhaps they didn't remember, or perhaps they understood that protecting a colleague was one of the few resistances available to them. Victor learned of the interrogations through his handler, who mentioned them with satisfaction during their next meeting. "Your report was productive," the superior said. "We've identified several persons of concern who require closer attention." Victor nodded, accepting this as acknowledgement of work well done. He walked out of Lubyanka and into Moscow's late summer heat, the sun bright and merciless overhead. His justifications were ready, rehearsed in the sleepless hours since filing the report. He was protecting the state from genuine threats to ideological unity. He was protecting his family by demonstrating absolute cooperation, ensuring that his own loyalty remained unquestioned. He was preventing worse consequences. Better that people received warnings now than arrests later. These justifications had the benefit of being partially true. The Soviet security apparatus rewarded compliance and punished hesitation. An officer who failed to report suspicious activities became suspect himself. Protecting Irina by concealing evidence would ultimately protect nothing. It would simply ensure that both their files were marked with questions about reliability. What Victor could not justify, even to himself, was the growing gap between the man who filed reports and the man who came home to his wife each evening. The split had become a chasm. He existed in two states simultaneously, neither one fully real. That evening, Irina prepared dinner as usual: fried potatoes and sausage, black bread, tea. The children talked about school. The television broadcast news about agricultural production exceeding targets. Everything was ordinary, domestic, safe. Irina mentioned that she'd heard from a friend that some guests from Leonid's party had been questioned by authorities. She seemed worried, but not surprised. "This is what happens now," she said quietly. "You attend a birthday party and it becomes an investigation." Victor ate his dinner and offered no comment. His silence, he understood, was its own form of betrayal, not quite lying, but withholding truth in a way that left Irina alone with her concerns. She didn't know that her husband had authored the report that led to those interrogations, didn't know that her own words were now documented in a file bearing her name, didn't know that the man across the table was both her protector and her surveiller, roles that could not be reconciled. Later that night, Victor stood at their bedroom window looking out at Moscow's lights, the city vast and indifferent below. Somewhere in Lubyanka, his report sat in a filing cabinet alongside thousands of others, each one a small act of betrayal in service to a system that required such acts for its continuation. He thought about Irina's question. "You've been different lately?" She was right. He had been different. He was becoming someone he didn't recognize, someone who could document his wife's private convictions and deliver them to men who would use that information to determine whether she represented a threat requiring neutralization. The worst part was that he would continue, would file next week's report and the week after, would catalogue her movements and conversations and friendships, would do this because the alternative, refusing, resigning, protecting her openly, would destroy them both more certainly than his cooperation. Victor pressed his forehead against the cold glass and closed his eyes, and knew that whatever happened next, he had already crossed a line from which there was no return. In the autumn of 1979, the second chief directorate of the KGB employed approximately 15,000 officers tasked with internal counterintelligence and surveillance of Soviet citizens. These officers, in turn, relied on a network of informants estimated to include between 1 and 2 million people, roughly 1 in every 50 Soviet citizens. The exact numbers remain disputed. Declassified archives from the 1990s provide incomplete data, with many records destroyed before the Soviet collapse. What historians agree on is that the surveillance apparatus was vast, pervasive, and operated through ordinary people who filed reports on neighbors, colleagues, family members. The second chief directorate was organized into 12 departments, each with specific responsibilities. The 7th department monitored tourists and foreign visitors. The 5th department tracked dissidents and religious groups. The 2nd department, where Viktor Sokolov served, focused on foreign diplomats and Soviet citizens with access to sensitive information or foreign contacts. The structure was bureaucratic, methodical, sustained by paperwork that transformed human behavior into data points suitable for filing and cross-reference. Victor's reports followed standardized formats developed over decades of security practice. The language was clinical, stripped of ambiguity. A colleague became a known dissident sympathizer. A dinner conversation became ideologically unreliable sentiments expressed in the presence of witnesses. Failing to inform authorities about someone else's suspicious behavior was failure to report as required under Article 190 of the Criminal Code. This bureaucratic precision served multiple purposes. It created legal justification for actions that might otherwise appear arbitrary. It distributed responsibility across layers of command so that no single individual bore full weight for consequences. And it transformed moral questions into administrative ones, not whether surveillance of one's spouse was right, but whether the documentation met departmental standards. Archives opened after 1991 reveal hundreds of cases similar to Victor's. File 3472K documents a case from 1976 in which an army colonel was ordered to monitor his wife, a librarian suspected of circulating samizdat literature. His reports led to her arrest and 5-year sentence. They divorced while she was in prison. Their 2 sons were placed with relatives after the colonel's military career continued without interruption. File 8891K from 1978 involves a schoolteacher in Leningrad who informed on her husband, a factory engineer who'd made jokes about party leadership at a kitchen table gathering. He was dismissed from his position and assigned to work in a metallurgical plant in Magadan. The marriage ended. The teacher received commendation for her vigilance. File 1203K describes a father who reported his 19-year-old son's involvement with an underground poetry group in Kiev. The son was sentenced to 3 years in a labor camp for anti-Soviet agitation. After his release, he emigrated to West Germany. Father and son never spoke again. These cases share common elements: subjects with access to sensitive materials or associations with suspect individuals, informants torn between family loyalty and state obligations, outcomes that destroyed relationships while preserving the informant's position within Soviet structures. The files describe these situations in the same neutral language Victor used in his reports: no acknowledgement of the human cost, no space for moral complexity. By September 1979, Victor had filed 24 weekly reports on IRINA. The file designated 4788K had grown to 78 pages. His handwriting filled most of them: careful notations of times and locations, transcriptions of telephone conversations, names of colleagues IRINA met for lunch at the Institute cafeteria. The recording equipment lived in a locked drawer in his desk at work. Every Monday and Thursday, he carried it home in his briefcase, changed the tape in the telephone device, returned the used tape for transcription. The RTU-47 weighed approximately 2 pounds. Victor felt it constantly during his commute, as though the weight increased with each week's accumulation of recorded conversations. The dead drops in Gorky Park followed an unchanging rhythm. Thursday mornings at 6 a.m., the same weathered newspaper box near the pond. Victor would arrive as the city was waking, deposit his report, mark the bench. By evening, the confirmation signal would appear. Sometimes he wondered who collected the reports, whether they knew he was surveilling his own wife, whether they discussed his case over lunch the way his colleagues at the Second Directorate discussed other operations. His meetings with his handler took place in a basement office in an unmarked building 3 blocks from Lubyanka. Room 12B, accessible through a side entrance that required 2 separate security clearances. The handler, Victor still didn't know his name, sat behind the same desk, read each report with the same methodical attention, asked questions designed to probe for gaps or inconsistencies. Your wife attended a lecture on Persian literature September 7th. Who else was present? The report lists all attendees I was able to identify. Dr. Berger was there. What did they discuss afterward? Translation methodology. There's a transcript in the supplemental materials. Nothing about his visa application, his brother in Israel. Nothing about those topics. The handler would make notes, file the report, dismiss Victor with instructions to maintain his current level of observation. The meetings lasted between 12 and 18 minutes. Victor would emerge into daylight feeling hollowed out, as though some essential part of himself had been extracted and filed away in room 12B. Sleep became difficult. Victor would lie beside Irina in their darkened bedroom, listening to her breathing, unable to stop his mind from cataloguing the day's observations. Irina had called her mother in Voronezh. Conversation about Natasha's progress in school, nothing significant. Irina had met Anna Leibovitz for tea, discussion of a translation project, mentioned that Anna still couldn't find work. Irina had helped Alexei with his homework, displaying the patience Victor no longer felt he possessed. The insomnia left him exhausted, his colleagues noticed. During a briefing about diplomatic contacts requiring surveillance, Victor lost his train of thought mid-sentence, staring at documents without processing their content. His supervisor asked if he needed time off. Victor declined, understanding that taking leave would raise questions about his fitness for sensitive assignments. His distance from his children manifested in small ways. Natasha asked him to help with a history report about the Great Patriotic War. Victor agreed, then spent the evening reviewing surveillance transcripts instead. When Natasha brought him her finished draft, he realized he'd forgotten entirely. She looked hurt, but said nothing. Alexei invited him to play chess, the game Leonid Berger had taught him. Victor made excuses about work obligations. The boy's disappointment was visible, quickly hidden behind the stoic expression children learn when they understand that asking for attention is futile. Irina noticed. Of course she noticed. A wife of 14 years recognizes when her husband has become a stranger, occupying familiar space. Testimony from Irina's later interviews, conducted in 1994 after she accessed her KGB file, describes this period with painful clarity. She recalled Victor's silences at dinner, his mechanical responses to questions, the way he seemed to observe rather than participate in family life. She assumed he was having an affair or dealing with classified work too sensitive to discuss, or experiencing some crisis of faith in the system they'd both served. I asked him repeatedly what was wrong, she told the interviewer. He would say he was tired or stressed about work. I believed him because I wanted to believe him. The alternative, that he'd stopped trusting me, was too painful to consider. She described lying awake herself, listening to Victor's restless movements beside her, wondering when their marriage had begun to calcify into performance. They still shared a bed, shared meals, shared the practical tasks of raising children. But the intimacy that had sustained them through early poverty and separation during his Afghanistan posting had vanished, replaced by something that looked like marriage but felt hollow. In October, Irina suggested they visit Victor's parents at the Dasha for the weekend. Victor invented obligations at work, though the actual reason was simpler. He couldn't bear the performance required to maintain normalcy for an entire weekend. His mother would ask about grandchildren, about Irina's work, about their plans for the future. Victor would have to construct answers that preserved the fiction of an intact family while carrying knowledge that he was actively documenting his wife's potential crimes against the state. The culture of fear that sustained this surveillance network was rarely discussed openly, but everyone understood its operation. Soviet citizens learned early to calibrate their speech, to recognize which conversations were safe and which could lead to consequences. People developed private languages, spoke in euphemisms, knew that certain topics required particular settings or absolute trust in one's listeners. What made the system effective was its invisibility. Most people never knew they were being monitored. The surveillance was selective, targeted, calibrated to specific threats. But the possibility of surveillance was universal, creating a climate where self-censorship became reflexive. People informed on others partly from ideological conviction, partly from fear, and partly because the system made informing seem like civic duty rather than betrayal. Victor existed at the intersection of these forces. He was simultaneously enforcer and victim, observer and observed. His reports on Irina were themselves being evaluated as evidence of his own reliability. If he failed to document suspicious behavior, or if his documentation seemed inadequate, his own file would accumulate notations questioning his fitness for continued sensitive work. The machinery operated through men like Victor, people who accepted impossible assignments because refusal meant destruction, who filed reports that destroyed lives while justifying their actions as necessary for collective security. The system didn't require monsters, it required ordinary people willing to make small compromises that accumulated into catastrophe. By November, Victor had filed 36 reports. Irina's file had grown to 124 pages. Most of the material was mundane: grocery shopping, visits to her mother, conversations about academic minutiae. But threaded through this mundane documentation were markers that, in aggregate, constructed a portrait of ideological unreliability. Her continued friendship with Berger, despite his refusionic status, her expressed sympathy for scientists denied international contact, her attendance at gatherings where prohibited topics were discussed. None of this constituted criminal activity. All of it constituted evidence that could justify further surveillance, employment difficulties, denial of privileges. The machinery didn't require proof of actual wrongdoing. Association, sympathy, proximity, these were sufficient. On November 15th, Victor filed his weekly report and walked home through early winter darkness. Moscow was already cold, snow accumulating in dirty piles along the sidewalks. He climbed the stairs to apartment 7B and found Irina in the kitchen preparing dinner. Buckwheat kasha and sausage, tea in the old ceramic pot. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, not anger, not suspicion, but something closer to resignation. "We need to talk," she said. Victor felt his chest constrict. "About what?" "About whatever is happening between us. About why you've become someone I don't recognize." He had no answer that wouldn't be either a lie or a confession. So he said what he'd been saying for months. "Work has been difficult. I'm sorry." Irina studied his face, then turned back to the stove. "I don't believe you," she said quietly, "but I don't know what else to do." They ate dinner in near silence while the children talked about school. After the meal, Victor retreated to the bedroom and lay in darkness, listening to the sounds of his family beyond the door, carrying the weight of everything he couldn't say. On December 3rd, 1979, at approximately 5:45 in the morning, 4 men in civilian clothing knocked on the door of apartment 8D at 47 Tverskaya Street. Leonid Berger answered wearing pajamas and slippers, his reading glasses crooked on his face. He'd been awake for 20 minutes preparing tea in the kitchen while Vera still slept. The men showed identification, KGB credentials, and informed him he was under arrest. The charges: anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda under Article 70 of the RSFSR Criminal Code. Maximum penalty: 7 years imprisonment plus 5 years internal exile. Vera emerged from the bedroom as the officers were handcuffing her husband. She started to scream, but Leonid shook his head and she swallowed the sound, pressing her hand against her mouth. One of the officers told her to remain in the main room while they conducted a search. She was not to touch the telephone. She was not to leave the apartment. The search began at 6:10 a.m. and continued for 11 hours. They dismantled the Berger's life with bureaucratic thoroughness. Every book examined, pages fanned to check for hidden materials, every drawer emptied onto the floor, floorboards pried up in the hallway. The toilet tank opened, the refrigerator pulled away from the wall. Vera sat on the sofa watching men in dark suits catalogue her husband's library, stacking volumes in piles according to criteria she could only guess at. Approved, questionable, prohibited. What they found exceeded even the KGB's expectations. Behind a false panel in the bedroom closet, 17 samizdat manuscripts, including Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago, complete in 3 volumes. In a locked filing cabinet, correspondence with academics in Israel, France and the United States, letters discussing not just Persian poetry, but also conditions for Soviet Jews, refusenik cases, international pressure campaigns. Under a loose section of parquet flooring, typed pages of an essay Berger had been writing about censorship and academic freedom, unpublished and unpublishable within Soviet borders. The inventory filled 6 pages of official documentation. Each item was photographed, numbered, sealed in evidence bags. The officers worked without conversation, executing procedures refined through thousands of similar searches. At 9:30 a.m., Vera was taken to a separate room for interrogation. The questions were precise. How long had she known about the materials? Who else had access to the apartment? Which visitors had seemed interested in the hidden documents? Had her husband mentioned contact with foreign intelligence services? Vera answered that she knew nothing. Her husband kept his work private. She'd never seen the materials found during the search. No visitors had asked suspicious questions. She knew of no foreign intelligence contacts. The interrogator noted her responses without comment. Vera understood that her ignorance was both genuine and insufficient protection. In the Itsenti, machinery of Soviet justice, proximity to crime often functioned as crime itself. She was released after 3 hours with instructions not to leave Moscow. Berger was transported to Lefortovo prison, where he would remain during investigation and trial. News of the arrest spread through Moscow's academic community with the speed of all shocking information in a society where official channels communicated nothing and unofficial networks communicated everything. By noon, colleagues at the Institute of Oriental Studies had heard. By early afternoon, the information had reached everyone who'd ever worked with Berger or attended gatherings at his apartment. Irina learned while sitting in her office, translating a 14th-century Arabic astronomical text. A colleague knocked on her door, entered without waiting for invitation, and delivered the news in a whisper despite the office being private. She sat motionless for several minutes after the colleague left. Then she gathered her materials, told the department secretary she was unwell, and took the metro home. The ride lasted 35 minutes. Witnesses who saw her on the train later recalled a woman sitting rigidly upright, staring at nothing, her face drained of color. Victor was already at the apartment when she arrived. He'd received a telephone call at work at 10:15 a.m. His handler's voice, clipped and businesslike, informing him of Berger's arrest and instructing him to return home immediately to observe Irina's reaction when she learned the news. He'd been waiting for 2 hours, manufacturing reasons in his mind for why he'd left work early. A headache, paperwork he needed to complete at home. The lies accumulated like layers of sediment. Irina walked through the door and saw him sitting at the kitchen table. For a moment, neither spoke. "Leonid was arrested this morning," she said finally. Her voice was steady, but hollow, as though spoken from a great distance. "They searched his apartment, found samizdat materials, Victor nodded, feigning the appropriate shock. I heard rumors at work. I wasn't certain if... It's true. Irina sat down across from him. Vera called someone at the institute. They took him to Lefortovo. The charges? Article 70, anti-Soviet agitation. She looked at her hands, fingers interlaced on the table. He could get 7 years. Victor watched her carefully, noting details he would later transcribe into his report. The tremor in her hands, the careful control of her expression, the way she refused to cry despite obvious distress. He felt simultaneous urges to comfort her and to document her grief as evidence of her connection to an enemy of the state. "I'm sorry," he said. The words were genuine and useless. Irina looked up at him then, her eyes searching his face for something she couldn't articulate. "Did you know this was coming?" The question struck him like physical force. "How would I know?" "I don't know. You work in that world. You hear things." She shook her head. "Never mind. Forget I asked." They sat in silence as afternoon darkened toward evening. The children would be home from school soon. Victor wondered how they would explain Leonid's absence, what lies they would construct to protect Natasha and Alexei from understanding that their honorary uncle was now an enemy of the people. At 6 o'clock, the telephone rang. Irina answered. Victor could hear only her side of the conversation, but her expression told him enough. She hung up after 5 minutes and turned to face him. Some of Leonid's colleagues are organizing a petition, demanding fair treatment, an open trial, access to legal representation. Her voice had regained some strength, the shock giving way to anger. "I'm going to sign it." Victor felt ice in his stomach. "That would be a mistake." "A mistake?" Irina's eyes flashed. "He's our friend. He's being persecuted for his beliefs. How is defending him a mistake? It won't help him. It will only—" Victor stopped himself, knowing he'd already said too much. "Only what? Make trouble for me?" Irina stood, her chair scraping against the floor. "Is that what you're worried about? My career, my position?" "I'm worried about our family." Victor's voice rose despite his attempt at control. "Signing that petition accomplishes nothing. It won't get Berger released. It will only mark you as a sympathizer." "I am a sympathizer," Irina was shouting now, 14 years of accumulated restraint breaking through. "He's innocent of any real crime. He read books, he wrote essays, he maintained friendships with people abroad. These things shouldn't be crimes. But they are." Victor spoke the truth he'd been holding back for 9 months. Under Article 70, they are crimes, and associating yourself publicly with him makes you complicit. Irina stared at him as though seeing a stranger. "When did you become this person? When did you stop believing that some things matter more than safety?" Victor had no answer. The person she'd married had believed in the Soviet project, in building a better world through collective sacrifice. That person had eroded over years of service to systems that valued security over truth, compliance over conscience. What remained was someone who filed reports on his wife and called it duty. "I'm trying to protect you," he said. "By telling me to abandon my friend, by asking me to pretend his arrest is acceptable." Irina's voice dropped to something harder than anger. "That's not protection. That's cowardice." The word hit Victor like an accusation he couldn't refute. He was a coward, had been for months, filing reports instead of refusing, documenting his wife's statements instead of defending her, serving a system that demanded he choose between family and state, and choosing in ways that betrayed both. "You don't understand the reality of the situation," he said. "Then explain it to me." Irina moved closer, her face inches from
Explain why our friend's arrest is justified. Explain why defending him is wrong. Explain why you've become someone who accepts this. Victor couldn't. To explain would require confession. That he'd been surveilling her. That he knew details of Berger's case before the arrest. That signing the petition would guarantee her own files escalation from monitoring to active investigation. The truth would destroy what remained of their marriage more completely than any lie. I can't, he said. Irina looked at him with an expression combining contempt and grief. Then we have nothing more to discuss. She left the kitchen. Victor heard the bedroom door close with deliberate gentleness, a controlled violence more devastating than slamming. He sat alone at the table as darkness completed its claim on the apartment. The children would be home soon from their after-school activities. He would need to explain why their mother was crying in the bedroom, why dinner wasn't prepared, why the atmosphere felt like the aftermath of an explosion. Instead, Victor retrieved his notebook from the locked drawer in his desk. He documented the conversation in precise detail. Irina's intention to sign the petition, the names of colleagues organizing it, her explicit statement that she considered Berger's activities non-criminal. He noted her emotional state, her accusations against him, the deterioration of their discussion into argument. At the bottom of the page, he added an assessment. Subject demonstrates strong sympathies with accused. Planned action, petition signature, represents significant escalation of ideological unreliability. Immediate intervention recommended to prevent subject's formal association with dissident activity. He read what he'd written and understood what it meant. His report would trigger action, surveillance of the petition organizers, possible interrogations, at minimum a formal warning that would enter Irina's permanent record. By documenting her intention, he was protecting her from the consequences of following through. By betraying her confidence, he was saving her from her own convictions. The justifications felt hollow, even as he constructed them. Victor sealed the report in an envelope and placed it in his briefcase. Tomorrow was Thursday. He would make the dead drop at 6 a.m., 3 hours earlier than his normal schedule, marking it as urgent. His handler would read it by mid-morning. The machinery would begin its operation. Outside the bedroom, he could hear Irina's muffled crying. He stood at the door with his hand raised to knock, to offer comfort or explanation or apology. But he had nothing to say that wouldn't be another lie, another layer of deception added to the structure he'd built between them. Victor lowered his hand and walked to the kitchen to wait for his children to come home. He would prepare their dinner, help with homework, maintain the performance of normalcy. He would do this while carrying an envelope containing words that would save his wife from her loyalty and condemn her for her conscience. The apartment felt cold despite the radiator's heat. Victor sat at the table where he'd eaten thousands of meals with his family and felt the full weight of what he'd become. A man who protected his wife by destroying her trust, who served his country by surveilling those he loved, who maintained his position by filing reports that transformed ordinary human decency into evidence of crime. He closed his eyes and waited for the sound of his children's footsteps on the stairs, knowing that when they arrived he would smile and ask about their day, and pretend that nothing had changed, that their family remained intact, that the machinery grinding toward their destruction was anything other than what it was. The detention came 47 hours after Victor filed his urgent report. On December the 5th, 1979, at 2:30 in the afternoon, 2 plainclothes officers approached Irina as she left the Institute of Oriental Studies. They identified themselves with minimal courtesy and requested she accompany them to answer questions regarding an ongoing investigation. The phrasing was careful. Not an arrest, merely a conversation. But Irina understood the distinction was semantic. She went with them. They drove to a militia station in an unmarked sedan. No handcuffs, no physical coercion, just the implicit understanding that refusal wasn't an option. The building was anonymous concrete on the city's outskirts, the kind of structure that existed in every Soviet neighborhood, performing functions citizens learned not to ask about. The interrogation room measured approximately 12 feet by 10. A metal table, 3 chairs, fluorescent lighting that made everything look sickly and overexposed. One of the officers offered her tea. She declined. They began with procedural matters: her full name, date of birth, current employment, residence address. Information they already possessed, questions designed to establish the rhythm of compliance. Then the substantive inquiry began. "You're acquainted with Leonid Davidovich Berger?" "Yes, he's a colleague, a friend." "How long have you known him?" "Approximately 7 years, since I began work at the Institute." "Would you characterize your relationship as close?" "We're friends. Our families socialize." The questions continued for 6 hours. The interrogator, a man in his 40s with the patient demeanor of someone who conducted such sessions routinely, asked about every interaction Irina could remember with Berger. When had she last visited his apartment? Who else had been present? What topics had they discussed? Had Berger ever shown her samizdat materials? Had he asked her to carry messages to foreign contacts? Did she know about his correspondence with academics in Israel? Irina answered truthfully. She'd visited the Bergers socially, they'd discussed academic work, she'd seen no prohibited materials, she knew nothing about foreign correspondence beyond Berger's legitimate, scholarly communications. "We have information that you intended to sign a petition protesting Dr. Berger's arrest." The statement landed like a stone, dropping into still water. Irina felt the ripples of implications spreading outward. Someone had informed, someone in the phone conversation 2 days earlier, or someone Irina had mentioned the petition to afterward. The surveillance network was tighter than she'd imagined. "I considered it," she said carefully. "I believe Leonid deserves fair legal representation." "You believe the Soviet justice system won't provide that?" The question was a trap. Irina recognized it, but had no safe path through. "I believe all accused persons deserve advocacy." The interrogator made notes, asked about her political views, whether she'd read unauthorized literature, whether she maintained contact with foreign nationals, whether she understood that association with persons convicted under Article 70 could have consequences for her own position and security clearance. Throughout, his tone remained neutral, almost conversational. This wasn't brutality, no physical threats, no shouting, just the steady application of institutional pressure, the reminder that she existed within systems that could destroy her employment, her reputation, her freedom with procedural efficiency. She was released at 8:40 p.m. with a verbal warning. Continued association with dissident elements would be viewed unfavorably. She should reconsider her friendships and activities. Her cooperation was expected. Irina walked out into December darkness, her legs unsteady, her mind struggling to process what had happened. The metro ride home took 40 minutes. She spent it staring at her reflection in the window glass, seeing a woman who'd crossed some invisible threshold into a category she'd never imagined occupying, person under investigation. Victor was waiting when she arrived. He had been home since 6 o'clock, his handler having called to inform him that Irina was being questioned and that he should be present to observe her state upon return. He'd spent 2.5 hours sitting at the kitchen table, alternating between anxiety about Irina's well-being and preparation for the performance he would need to deliver. She came through the door looking exhausted and frightened in ways Victor had never seen. He stood, moved toward her, asked what had happened. His concern was genuine. He did worry about her, did fear the machinery he'd set in motion. That the worry coexisted with his role in causing it was a contradiction he could no longer resolve. Irina told him everything: the detention, the questions, the hours in the interrogation room, the warning about her associations. Her voice was flat, reciting facts without inflection, as though emotion had been temporarily suspended. "They knew about the petition," she said. "They knew before any of us had even signed it. Someone told them." Victor manufactured appropriate shock and anger. "Who would—" "I don't know." Irina sat heavily at the table. "Someone at the Institute, someone in that phone conversation. It doesn't matter. The point is, they're watching." "Of course they're watching. Berger was arrested for serious charges. They're investigating his associates. I'm not an associate of anything criminal." For the first time, anger broke through her exhaustion. "I'm a translator. I attended birthday parties. That's my crime. Friendship with someone the state has decided is an enemy." Victor sat across from her, performing the role of supportive husband while calculating what he would write in tomorrow's report. "You need to distance yourself from this situation, from the petition, from Berger's other friends, from anything that could be misinterpreted." "So I should abandon everyone because I'm frightened?" "Yes," Victor said bluntly. "You should be frightened, and you should protect yourself." Irina studied him with an expression he couldn't read. "You sound like you speak from experience." "I work in security. I understand how investigations operate." She seemed about to say something more, then changed her mind. The moment passed. They sat in silence until exhaustion drove them both to bed. The next morning, Victor received his new instructions. The meeting took place at 9:00 a.m. in room 12B. His handler was already present, along with a second officer Victor didn't recognize. Older, more senior, wearing a uniform that indicated rank Victor would normally salute. "Major Sokolov." The senior officer didn't offer introduction. "Your wife's interrogation yesterday revealed concerning patterns. She maintains sympathy for Berger, despite understanding the charges. She considered signing a petition that would have associated her formally with dissident activity. Her security clearance at the Institute makes her continued reliability a matter requiring resolution." Victor listened, his spine rigid. "Effective immediately, Irina Mikhailovna Sokolova is classified as a person of operational interest. You will maintain current surveillance protocols with enhanced attention to foreign contacts and ideological indicators. If she makes any further suspicious moves, attempts to sign petitions, attends gatherings with known dissidents, communicates with Berger's family, arrest is authorized under Article 190-1, failure to report crimes against the state." The officer slid a document across the desk. Victor recognized the form, authorization for enhanced surveillance, including possible detention. His wife's name typed at the top. His own signature required at the bottom as monitoring officer. "Is there a problem, Major?" Victor found his voice. "Request permission to speak freely." The officer nodded. "My wife is not a threat to state security. She's loyal to a friend who's been arrested. Her sympathy is personal, not political. She has no involvement in actual dissident activities, no contacts with foreign intelligence, no participation in samizdat networks. Enhanced classification seems disproportionate to the evidence." The handler spoke for the first time. Your reports over the past 9 months document consistent ideological unreliability, association with refuseniks, expression of sympathy for persons prosecuted under Article 70, criticism of state policy regarding scientific contacts with foreign nationals. The pattern is clear. The pattern, Victor said carefully, reflects normal conversation among educated people. Half the academics in Moscow have similar discussions. It doesn't constitute criminal activity. The senior officer's expression hardened. Your personal feelings about your wife's guilt or innocence are irrelevant. You have your orders. The question is whether you can execute them professionally. The implication was unmistakable. Victor's own reliability was now in question. If he protected Irina, if he failed to document future suspicious activities, if he showed any indication of prioritizing family loyalty over state obligation, his own file would be marked with notations that could end his career or worse. I can execute my orders, Victor said. Good. Sign the authorization. Victor picked up the pen. The document required his signature in 3 places, acknowledging that he understood the enhanced surveillance parameters, that he accepted responsibility for reporting any activities that met the threshold for arrest, that he consented to having his own communications monitored to ensure compliance. He signed. The meeting ended 10 minutes later. Victor walked out of the building into Moscow's winter cold, carrying the weight of what he'd just agreed to. He had become his wife's jailer, authorized to trigger her arrest if she followed her conscience into actions the state defined as criminal. Archives from this period contain records of other officers who faced similar choices. Captain Dmitry Volkov, documented in file 2891K, refused an order to monitor his brother, a journalist suspected of samizdat involvement. Volkov was reassigned to administrative duties in Siberia. His brother was arrested anyway, sentenced to 4 years. Volkov's career never recovered. Lieutenant Colonel Sergei Antonov, file 4402K, falsified reports on his wife to minimize evidence of her contact with Baptist church groups. The deception was discovered during a routine audit. Antonov was court-martialed for dereliction of duty, reduced in rank, imprisoned for 2 years. His wife was arrested and sentenced to 5 years internal exile. Major Pavel Kushnir, file 7714K, reported his son's involvement with an underground printing operation. The son received 7 years in a labor camp. Kushnir was commended for his loyalty to the state. He committed suicide 3 years later, though the file attributes his death to health complications. The cases illustrated variations on the same impossible calculus: refuse and face consequences while failing to protect the person you're refusing to betray, or comply and destroy your family from within while maintaining your position in the system that demanded the destruction. Victor had chosen compliance, had signed the authorization, accepted the enhanced orders, agreed to continue surveillance that could now lead directly to Irina's arrest. He told himself this was the only rational choice, that refusing would accomplish nothing except his own destruction alongside hers, that maintaining his position gave him at least some ability to influence outcomes, that his reports could continue to walk the line between satisfying superiors and protecting his wife. But he knew the truth. He'd chosen compliance because he lacked the courage to refuse, because his identity had become so thoroughly embedded in his service to the state that he couldn't imagine existence outside those structures, because saying no to room 12B would require becoming a different person. And Victor no longer knew who that person might be. He returned home that evening to find Irina preparing dinner, as though the previous day's interrogation had been a minor inconvenience rather than a fundamental assault on her security. She'd decided, she told him, not to sign the petition. Too risky. not worth jeopardizing her position at the Institute or the family's stability. "You were right," she said without looking at him. "Sometimes discretion is the better choice." Victor felt relief and revulsion in equal measure. Relief that her decision removed immediate danger, revulsion at his own role in manufacturing that danger, at his satisfaction that fear had accomplished what his arguments couldn't. "I'm glad," he said, and meant it and hated himself for meaning it. They ate dinner with Natasha and Alexei, discussed homework and school activities, performed the rituals of ordinary family life. Beneath the performance, Victor carried knowledge that would appear in tomorrow's report. Subject has abandoned intention to sign petition. Enhanced surveillance continues, no immediate action required. He'd saved his wife from arrest by terrifying her into silence. He'd protected his family by becoming the instrument of their oppression. He'd maintained his position by signing documents authorizing him to imprison the woman he'd promised to cherish. The choice had been impossible. Victor had made it anyway. That's what the machinery required, not monsters, but ordinary men, willing to make impossible choices and call them necessary. The falsifications began in February 1980, small omissions that Victor told himself were insignificant. Irina met Anna Leibovitz for lunch on February the 14th. Their conversation, captured on the telephone recording when Anna called to arrange the meeting, included criticism of new censorship policies affecting academic publications. Victor's report documented the lunch, but characterized the conversation as discussion of translation work, no ideological content. On February 22nd, Irina attended a memorial gathering for a colleague who'd died of heart failure. Among the 30 people present were several individuals Victor recognized from surveillance photographs. Associates of Berger, people who'd signed petitions or attended unsanctioned lectures. Victor's report listed the gathering as funeral attendance, brief social interaction, no suspicious activities observed. He omitted 6 names from his list of attendees. March 3rd, Irina received a letter from Vera Berger describing visiting conditions at Lefortovo prison before Leonid's sentencing. The letter mentioned that Leonid's health was deteriorating, that he'd lost weight, that he remained defiant about his convictions. Victor read the letter while changing the tape in the telephone device. His report mentioned that Irina had received correspondence from Berger's wife, but described the content as personal matters, no political discussion. Each omission was defensible. Each could be explained as judgment about operational relevance versus mundane detail. But collectively, they represented a shift in Victor's approach, from documenting everything to curating what reached his superiors. It was dangerous. The KGB maintained overlapping surveillance networks precisely to catch such falsifications. If someone else was monitoring Irina, a neighbor recruited as informant, a colleague at the institute, someone following her on the street, discrepancies between Victor's reports and other sources would raise immediate questions about his reliability. His handler noticed by mid-March. The meeting in room 12B had a different quality than previous sessions. The handler spent longer examining Victor's reports, comparing them against other documents Victor couldn't see, making notes with obvious skepticism. "Your wife's activities have decreased significantly since December," the handler observed. "Almost no contact with Berger's associates, minimal discussion of his case, no attendance at questionable gatherings." "She was frightened by the interrogation," Victor said. "She's being cautious." "Or you're being selective in your reporting." The accusation hung in the air. Victor kept his expression neutral. "I report what I observe." "Then perhaps your observation has become less thorough." The handler closed the file. "We'll be implementing supplementary monitoring to ensure comprehensive coverage." Victor understood. They were checking his work, verifying his reports against Independent sources, his margin for protective omissions had just collapsed. The reassignment order came in April. Victor was summoned to a different office, a different superior. This one a colonel he'd met only twice before, at ceremonial functions where junior officers stood at attention while senior leadership delivered speeches about vigilance and duty. Major Sokolov, you're being posted to East Germany. September 1st. Liaison work with the Stasi, 18-month rotation. Your family will remain in Moscow. The phrasing was standard for such assignments. The timing was not. Officers with family security concerns weren't typically sent on foreign postings. Victor recognized this for what it was: punishment for suspected unreliability and a test to see if Irina's activities would escalate in his absence. Understood, Victor said. Your current surveillance assignment will conclude in August. A different officer will assume monitoring responsibilities for your wife during your absence. Victor felt something cold settle in his chest. Someone else would be reading Irina's mail, transcribing her phone calls, documenting her movements. Someone with no personal stake in her well-being, no reason to exercise the protective discretion Victor had been attempting. He left the meeting understanding that his efforts to shield Irina had failed. The machinery had noted his hesitation and responded by removing him from the equation. Spring brought the news everyone had been anticipating. On April 8th, Leonid Berger was sentenced to 5 years internal exile in Aktau, Kazakhstan. The trial had lasted 3 days, closed to outside observers. Berger was permitted an attorney who'd spent most of the proceedings arguing for leniency based on his client's age and scholarly contributions. The judge was unmoved. Irina learned from Vera, who called that evening sounding hollowed out by grief and exhaustion. Victor listened to Irina's side of the conversation, expressions of sympathy, offers of help, promises to visit Vera soon. After hanging up, Irina sat at the kitchen table staring at nothing. 5 years, she said finally. He's 52. 5 years in Kazakhstan, and he'll be 57. Victor had no comfort to offer. That wouldn't be obscene. I'm sorry. Are you? Irina looked at him with an expression he couldn't interpret. You've been telling me to distance myself from him for months. Now the state has done it for me. That's not what I wanted, isn't it? She stood, began clearing dinner dishes with mechanical precision. You've gotten exactly what you advised. Leonid is gone. I'm frightened. I've stopped seeing friends you disapproved of. We're safe now. Isn't that what matters? Victor had no answer, because she was right. He had wanted her frightened enough to be cautious, isolated enough to be safe. He'd achieved this through methods she would never know, and her safety was indistinguishable from her oppression. The months that followed were characterized by progressive withdrawal. Irina stopped attending social gatherings almost entirely. She went to work, came home, helped the children with schoolwork, prepared meals with the efficiency of someone performing obligations rather than participating in life. When colleagues invited her to lectures or dinners, she declined with polite excuses. Victor watched her contract into smaller and smaller spaces, professionally competent, personally absent, frightened in ways she tried to hide from the children. He'd accomplished what the interrogation had started, breaking her spirit enough to ensure compliance. The distance between them became physical. They still shared a bed but slept on opposite edges, careful not to touch. Conversations became transactional. Who would pick up Alexei from school? Whether they needed to buy bread? What time Victor would be home from work? The intimacy that had sustained 14 years of marriage evaporated, replaced by polite cohabitation between two people who no longer trusted each other. Irina sensed Victor's withdrawal but misunderstood its source. She interpreted his distance as judgment, that he blamed her for the interrogation, resented her friendship with Berger, saw her as a liability to his career. She wasn't entirely wrong, but the reality was more complex and more devastating than she imagined. Victor carried knowledge he couldn't share, that he'd authored the reports that led to her interrogation, that he continued to monitor her, that he would soon be replaced by someone with less reason to protect her. The weight of it manifested in insomnia that left him exhausted, in shortened temper with the children, in an inability to maintain the performance of normalcy that had sustained him through winter. In May, Natasha asked why her parents never smiled anymore. 13 years old, old enough to recognize dysfunction but too young to understand its sources. Victor told her that adults sometimes went through difficult periods, that it had nothing to do with her or Alexei, that everything would be fine. The lies came easily now. June arrived with unseasonable heat. Victor had 2 months before his departure for East Germany. His reports had become minimalist, brief notations that Irina went to work, came home, engaged in no suspicious activities. Even these sparse observations felt like betrayals. On June 17th, Victor made his decision. He waited until Irina took the children to visit her mother in Voronezh, a trip that would keep them away for 3 days. Alone in the apartment, he dismantled the recording equipment from the telephone. The RTU-47 came apart easily. He'd installed and removed such devices dozens of times. He placed it in his briefcase along with the unused tapes and the notebook containing 9 months of handwritten observations. At work the next day, he incinerated everything in a basement furnace used for destroying classified materials. He watched the tapes melt, the pages curl and blacken, the equipment reduced to twisted metal. The destruction took 11 minutes. His final report, filed June 19th, was 3 paragraphs. Subject: Irina Mikhailovna Sokolova has demonstrated consistent compliance with behavioral expectations since December 1979 interrogation. No contact with dissident elements, no attendance at unauthorized gatherings, no expression of ideologically unreliable sentiments. Subject focuses on professional responsibilities and family obligations. Assessment: subject's association with arrested individual. Berger was personal rather than political. Subject has ceased all questionable activities. Subject poses no security risk. Recommendation: surveillance may be discontinued. Subject requires no further monitoring. He signed it, deposited it in the dead drop, marked it as his final submission on this case. Victor understood the risk. His superiors might reject the recommendation, might question why he believed surveillance should end when Irina remained employed at a sensitive institution. But he was being reassigned anyway, his credibility already compromised by suspected protective reporting. The final report was an act of defiance disguised as professional assessment. The confirmation mark appeared on the lamppost that afternoon. No immediate response, no summons to room 12B. Victor waited for consequences that didn't materialize. Either his recommendation had been accepted, or his superiors had simply decided to wait until a new monitoring officer was assigned. The remaining weeks before his departure passed with surreal normalcy. Victor prepared for the posting, briefings about East German operations, language refreshers for his already fluent German, administrative processing that included security reviews and loyalty affirmations. At home, Irina helped him organize what he'd need to take, performing the duties of a military wife preparing for her husband's assignment. They never discussed the state of their marriage, never acknowledged that Victor's departure felt more like abandonment than duty, never spoke about the fact that 18 months apart might be permanent separation. On his final night before departure, they lay in bed in darkness, both awake, neither speaking. Victor wanted to tell her everything about the surveillance, the reports, his attempts to protect her, his failures and compromises, and the impossible choices he'd faced. But confession would serve only his need for absolution, not her need for understanding. "I'll write," he said finally. "All right," Irina replied. In the morning, he kissed the children goodbye, shook Irina's hand with formal awkwardness, and carried his single suitcase down the stairs. At the street, he turned back to look at the building. Irina stood at the window of apartment 7B, watching him leave. Their eyes met across the distance. Neither waved. Victor walked away carrying the weight of everything he'd done and everything he could never say, leaving behind a family he'd tried to protect by methods that had destroyed them anyway. The machinery had required impossible choices. Victor had made them one after another until the man who'd married Irina Petrova in 1965 no longer existed. What remained was someone who'd filed his final report and walked away, hoping that the absence of surveillance might be the closest thing to redemption he could offer. Viktor Sokolov departed for East Germany on September 2, 1980, carrying a single suitcase and the knowledge that he might never repair what he'd broken. The posting was initially scheduled for 18 months. In November 1981, it was extended another year, officially due to operational needs, though Victor suspected the real reason was that his superiors saw no urgency in bringing him home. A second extension came in 1982. He didn't return to Moscow until March 1983, 30 months after leaving. East Germany was grey, architecturally, politically, atmospherically. Victor worked liaison assignments with the Stasi, coordinating intelligence sharing between Soviet and East German security services. The work was technical, bureaucratic, performed in offices that smelled of cigarette smoke and institutional disinfectant. He lived in a small apartment in East Berlin's Lichtenberg district, ate in state canteens, spent evenings alone reading or walking streets where every third person might be informing on the other two. He wrote to Irina monthly letters that contained nothing of substance, descriptions of weather, mentions of work colleagues in vague terms, questions about the children's schooling. Her responses were equally hollow. Natasha had joined the Komsomol. Alexei was struggling with mathematics. The apartment's radiator had broken and taken weeks to repair. The prose of two people who'd once shared intimacy, now exchanging information as distant acquaintances might. When Victor finally returned in 1983, he found that absence had simply formalized what had already occurred. Irina met him at the apartment with civility but not warmth. The children, now 16 and 12, seemed to have grown beyond recognition. Natasha was reserved, watchful, clearly protective of her mother. Alexei was polite but distant, addressing Victor as though speaking to a stranger who happened to share their surname. They maintained the appearance of marriage for 8 months. Victor slept on the sofa. They attended parent-teacher conferences together and celebrated New Year's with Victor's parents as though nothing fundamental had fractured. But the performance exhausted them both. In November 1983, Irina asked for a divorce. Victor agreed without argument. They filed paperwork in January 1984. Soviet divorce procedures were brief when both parties consented. Irina was granted custody of Natasha and Alexei. Victor was assigned visitation rights he rarely exercised. He moved to a communal apartment near his work, 3 rooms shared with 2 other families, the kind of accommodation he'd lived in decades earlier as a young officer. The file on Irina Mikhailovna Sokolova remained open but inactive. Quarterly reviews noted no suspicious activities, no contact with dissident elements, no ideological concerns. She continued work at the Institute of Oriental Studies, though her security clearance was never restored to its previous level. Her career plateaued, competent work, adequate salary, no advancement into positions requiring higher trust. In 1987, she met Grigory Volkov, a physicist at a research institute, divorced with one adult daughter. They married quietly in 1988. Witnesses described Volkov as kind, steady, someone who asked few questions about Irina's past. The marriage appeared, by all accounts, peaceful if not passionate. Viktor's career followed a similar trajectory of stagnation. He remained at the second chief directorate, but was never promoted beyond major. His assignments were administrative, supervisory, managing files, training junior officers, work that kept him away from operational decisions. Colleagues who'd been his peers in 1979 advanced to colonel to general. Viktor remained Major Sokolov, competent and forgettable. He never remarried, lived alone in a series of increasingly shabby apartments as the Soviet Union lurched toward collapse, watched the system he'd served begin its disintegration, Gorbachev's reforms, the opening of previously forbidden topics, the slow acknowledgement that the machinery of control had consumed more than it protected. In August 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. Viktor was 49 years old. The second chief directorate was dissolved, reorganized into new structures with new names but familiar functions. Officers were offered early retirement packages or positions in the successor agencies. Viktor took retirement. His pension was meager, worth less each month as inflation devoured the ruble's value. He found work with a private security firm, one of dozens that emerged to serve the new Russia's businesses and wealthy individuals. The work was mundane: background checks, facility security assessments, investigation of employee theft. Viktor performed it adequately, drawing on skills developed in intelligence work while avoiding questions about his previous employment. The archives opened gradually through the 1990s. First limited access for researchers, then broader availability under new transparency laws passed by a government trying to demonstrate its break from Soviet secrecy. Citizens could request their KGB files, though the process was bureaucratic and many records had been destroyed or remained classified. In April 1994, Irina Mikhailovna Volkov, formerly Sokolova, submitted a request for her file. The response came 3 months later, 147 pages, documenting surveillance from March 1979 to June 1980, interrogation transcripts from December 1979, assessment reports evaluating her ideological reliability, and 41 weekly reports written in handwriting she recognized immediately, her ex-husband's careful, methodical script. She read the file alone in her apartment while Grigory was at work. Read how Viktor had documented her movements, transcribed her telephone conversations, reported on her friendships and political statements. Read his assessment that she maintained dangerous associations with dissident sympathizers. Read his recommendation in December 1979 that she be classified as a person of operational interest, arrest authorized for further suspicious activities. The final report, dated June 1980, stood in stark contrast. Surveillance discontinued, subject poses no security risk. She didn't know what had prompted the reversal, only that for 15 months her husband had been her warden. She set the file aside and stared at the wall, feeling nothing at first, then everything simultaneously: betrayal, rage, grief for a marriage she'd thought had died from distance, and incompatibility rather than systematic deception. 2 weeks later, she called Viktor, asked to meet, specified a cafe near Tverskaya Street, neutral territory neither frequented. They met on July the 22nd, 1994, a Thursday afternoon. Viktor arrived first, already seated at a corner table when Irina walked in. He was 53, greying, wearing a suit that had seen better years. Irina was 51, still working at the institute, her face marked by years Viktor hadn't witnessed. They sat across from each other, without ordering anything. The cafe hummed with conversations around them. Knew Russia's chaotic energy, people discussing business ventures and foreign travel and possibilities that hadn't existed in the world they'd inhabited together. Irina placed the file folder on the table between them. Didn't open it. Victor looked at it and understood immediately what it contained. "I have one question," Irina said. Her voice was steady, emptied of emotion. "How long?" "March 1979 to June 1980, Victor said. 15 months. "The entire time, the interrogation, the warnings, everything, you were writing reports?" "Yes." "Did they order you to marry me too, or was that genuine?" The cruelty of the question was deserved. Victor absorbed it without flinching. "Everything before March 1979 was genuine. I loved you. I married you for no reason except that I wanted to spend my life with you." "But when they ordered you to spy on me, you did it." "Yes." "Why?" Victor had 15 years to prepare an answer and still had none adequate. "Because refusing would have destroyed us both. Because I thought I could protect you while following orders. Because I was a coward who chose loyalty to the system over loyalty to you." Irina studied his face. "Which of those reasons is true?" "All of them." They sat in silence. Around them, the cafe continued its business, people living lives in a country that no longer officially sanctioned husbands spying on wives, though the habits and structures of surveillance had survived the system's collapse. "I destroyed the recording equipment in June 1980, Victor said. Filed a final report saying you were no threat. I couldn't undo what I'd already done, but I tried to end it." 15 months, Irina said. "You documented my life for 15 months, then decided to stop. Should I be grateful?" "No." "Good." She stood. "I needed to see your face when you confirmed it. I needed to know it was real, not some bureaucratic error. Now I know." She picked up the file folder and walked toward the door. Victor remained seated, watching her leave for the second time, final time, carrying documentation of his betrayal. He never saw her again. The Soviet surveillance state generated millions of files, documented millions of lives, operated through millions of betrayals, both large and small. How many marriages were destroyed by assignments like Victor's? How many children grew up in homes where parents informed on each other? How many friendships ended when files revealed who had written which reports? The numbers are unknowable. Many records were destroyed. Many participants died carrying secrets. Many victims chose not to request files that would confirm their worst suspicions about people they'd trusted. What remains in the archives are fragments, individual cases that illuminate a system operating through intimate destruction. The machinery of totalitarian control required ordinary people to perform extraordinary betrayals, then rewarded them for actions that hollowed out their humanity. Viktor Sokolov, last confirmed alive in 2003 at age 61, never spoke publicly about his role in surveillance operations. No interviews, no memoirs, no attempts at justification or redemption. He worked security jobs until retirement, lived alone, maintained minimal contact with his children, who'd learned the truth from their mother after she received her file. Irina Volkov died in 2008 of pancreatic cancer, surrounded by her second husband and her children. Her obituary in an academic journal noted her contributions to Persian translation studies and made no mention of the years she'd spent under surveillance by the man she'd married. Natasha and Alexei Sokolov, contacted by researchers in 2019, declined to be interviewed about their parents' history. Natasha wrote a brief email. "Our family's story is private. We've chosen not to participate in its documentation. Please respect that choice." The question of responsibility in cases like Victor's is complicated. Was he a victim of a system that forced impossible choices, or a perpetrator who chose careerism over conscience? Was his initial compliance cowardice or calculation? Did his eventual cessation of surveillance represent moral awakening or simple exhaustion? The archives don't answer these questions. They document actions without resolving moral ambiguity. Victor filed reports that contributed to his wife's interrogation and isolation. Victor also falsified information to protect her and eventually stopped surveillance despite personal risk. Both statements are true. Both exist simultaneously. What's clear is that systems of control operate most effectively when they recruit ordinary people into complicity, when they create conditions where betrayal becomes indistinguishable from survival, when they distribute guilt so broadly that individual responsibility dissolves into collective participation. The machinery doesn't require monsters. It requires people like Viktor Sokolov, educated, loyal, capable of love and capable of documentation that transforms love into evidence. How many similar stories remain buried in archives? How many families were destroyed by surveillance they never knew existed? How many people carried secrets about their own complicity until death? The Soviet Union collapsed. The archives opened. Some truths emerged, but most stories remain where they were filed decades ago, in folders stored in basement rooms, marked with case numbers and classification stamps, documenting betrayals too numerous to catalogue and too intimate to fully comprehend. Viktor Sokolov's story is one among millions. It matters because it's documented. It matters because Irina discovered the truth and confronted him. It matters because their children know, even if they choose not to speak. Most stories never reach even that incomplete resolution. They remain in the machinery, classified and forgotten, small tragedies in a system that produced tragedy at industrial scale. What we know is this. On March 15, 1979, a man received orders to spy on his wife. He complied for 15 months. The surveillance destroyed their marriage, damaged their children, and left both parties carrying weights they would bear until death. The rest is silence and archives and the ongoing work of understanding how systems of control operated through the most intimate spaces of human life: the bedroom, the kitchen table, the whispered conversation between husband and wife in the darkness before sleep.